wandering posthumous, hopeless, horror-struck, invisible. The mountain stood, gentle against the sky, enveloped in wisps of cloud, like a fetus, peacefully strangled in its own placenta. There was a time when its hills and cliffs were vibrant with roads and the bustle of traffic, perfumed seductions from a warm future. Now they lie congealed, spidery, varicose veins on a rotting woman's corpse, incubating a bustling, furry, pubic undergrowth in which I am quite lost, wandering, posthumous, invisible. In a world where homesick, misanthropic stewardesses serve Bloody Marys to blonde athletes, imbecilic and dewy-eyed, on long, unexamined jets, destined to crash momentarily into soot-black seas, where young girls dye their hair purple, pierce their tongues, and let mindless high school boys fuck them, to torture their mums, impress their peers, and convince themselves they are alive, nay, that they even wish to be alive. There is a small, still place hidden beneath the crashing surf, and in between the echoes of 1,000 meaningless, barely attended, and fast forgotten conversations. I can't take you there, no one can. Shh, listen. I had a great-grandfather, once sun-drenched and bursting full of sap, the rapturous poetry of ravenous sweat and bulging desire pumping his green veins. Can you hear his heart pounding as he awakens in a violent seizure of dread and longing, convinced he is about to fall through the creaky wooden floor of his filthy hovel into the silent abyss of the airless night? Soon enough, he was sawdust, charnel soot, his once vibrant pulp bubbling and hissing on the walls of the ancient crematorium, digested by clouds and pissed by future rains on his children's children. Shh, be still. A baby is crying. Who can remember being fern, stalk, and lizard but a few moments ago? There is a message just over the horizon beyond the windswept lake where the fat ladies lie, sneaking furtive, greedy glances at the bronzed and muscled lifeguards. When one is sufficiently dehydrated, the surface of the eyeball acts as a powerful and mucus-filled glue, which fuses the eye and lid. One must then manually alternate the position of the lid, closing the eye when the burning sensation becomes intolerable, and opening it again when sight is either desirable or becomes essential. A ferocious inwardness, to which certain ancient cultures ascribed transcendent spiritual qualities, is thus attained. If one is able to sufficiently objectify this pain, to dissociate one's self from it, the need to frantically open and shut the eye subsides. The eyeball itself then becomes infected, growing gradually rigid, and sinking deeper and deeper into its socket. Paradoxically, one's second sight blossoms into a luxurious, intoxicating opulence. Job is an okay book if your cup of tea is a murderous, psychopathic God who revels in his egomaniacal, grandiose bluster, and who offers not a hint of solace. Personally, I prefer Ecclesiastes. I relate to the pomposity and narcissistic apathy concerning the suffering of others one finds in the former, but aspire to the world-weary, bird's-eye view of the latter. Would that there were some bird, perhaps some black as filth raven, infinitely large and powerful, upon whom I could hitch a ride to a nearby black hole, bubbling and ravenous, gobbling up the dying galaxy which surrounds it, and stopping only for the occasional belch or briefest of naps into which I could dive, vanish, forget, as if I never had been, my fondest wish. Cancel that. A blonde spilling out of her halter top just walked by, pouting. I'll stay for the movie after all. The eyes of new fathers follow the paths of their young children, scouting for potential danger, yet never failing to furtively check if you, too, are equally entranced by their magnificent progeny. In the locker room, they admire their own genitals in much the same way, a hormone-driven fugue state of delighted disbelief, pride, and befuddled bravado. And the child, that greedy little Frankenstein, from whose neck nature has graciously deigned to remove the bolts, in order that other hopeless, momentarily fertile blockheads might be hoodwinked into the very same cosmic, hopelessly overpriced Ponzi scheme, This Kentucky Derby of decay and death? Note how the thing drinks and experience indiscriminately, happily masticating on both the canvas of Caravaggio and the lead-filled paint chips on the floor with the same voracious gusto. An old man is an aged wine, whether subtle and fine or loathsomely bitter, a decaying piece of wooden sculpture whose bark has been whittled away by wisdom, weather, and worms. A burnished etching of Dürer, a chaotic, incoherent piece of disease-bearing driftwood which the sea has nonchalantly belched upon the beach. What he is, or was, these things matter not to the maggots who devour his entrails and deposit his eviscerated carcass on the crisp, fresh January snow. Roads that lead nowhere are extraordinarily well paved, traveled, and maintained. They routinely double back, actively reinserting themselves into the ongoing hurly-burly like a well-oiled, heat-seeking enema. A foolish old man with a wide-brimmed hat trips over a mole's den, awakening an incandescently blue woman's head and torso from the earth. As soon as she begins her insufferably pretentious, endless pontifications concerning the warp and woof of our mercy-starved world, he stuffs her yammering mouth full of dirt and boulders in a fit of wild fury. God occasionally whispers to man, but his mouth is always full of stale, cheap, 5-and-dime store crackers. When I was a boy, I held a match near the head of a tiny, helpless turtle in an attempt to make him feel the rib-crushing, suffocating horror that I felt bottled up as I was in a vice-like straitjacket and thrown into a world spinning wildly out of my control. I'll never forget his lacerating gaze of all-knowing anger, stuffed full to bursting with the ennui of 1 billion successive incarnations. That furious little homunculus was me, was you, was all of us, and we have all, you, I, he, seen it all, countless times, in scene after scene of inexhaustible absurdity. Everything, over and over again. If only we could remember. In medieval Thailand, female adulterers were routinely dismembered and then fed to members of the clergy in intricately carved rice bowls during highly stylized ceremonies. When one of the emperor's concubines was found with a member of the court, even a eunuch, the two were strapped to a fiercely barbed spit, rotating over a roaring charnel house fire, and forced to gag on one another's genitalia. Ceremonial scarves muffled the screams from their parched, stuffed throats as the flames gradually consumed them. If a concubine was found in the embrace of another concubine, the punishment was somewhat less ghoulish, but no less deadly. Bound naked, mouth to crotch, in the city square, under heavy guard, and with the incessant jeering of the townsfolk pummeling their brain cases like shrapnel, they were left for days, and sometimes weeks, to gradually starve to death. As radio wave-borne images of cute kitty videos careen out into galaxies 50 light-years from our lonely, desolate, mindlessly spinning Earth, as the boys we once knew come, more and more, to resemble wizened, post-menopausal grandmothers, as the parks, where we once bubbled over like the froth of fresh champagne, sparkling under a seemingly new and honeyed sun, are paved over and crushed to a thin crust of forgetting what remains for us. Who are we then, now? When the only measure of time's passing is each day's baffling, surreal strangeness, I saw an elderly gentleman skydive by my cabin window, fretfully ripping the innards out of an old spring-loaded clock, cursing all the while God, fate, the Buddha, his vile spouse, his ungrateful, spoiled children, and everyone else who couldn't be bothered any longer to notice or listen to him. During the Inquisition, persons with tapeworms in their guts were starved for many, many days. The Inquisitor would then jam a sugar-encrusted crucifix down their throats, replete with an infinitely detailed rendering of the suffering, lacerated Christ. When the worm finally emerged to encircle the cross, in a drunken, ecstatic bacchanal of insatiable filth, it was delicately disentangled, flayed alive, dyed the deepest purple, and entombed, for all eternity, in a meticulously constructed stained glass image of the temptation in Eden. The sufferer's throat was then slit, his carcass gutted, the entrails cremated, and poured into a box of tin, upon which had been placed many zealous and earnest curses by many zealous and earnest monks, which was eventually buried in unhallowed ground. In mathematics, there is a class of functions so transcendently beautiful that those few and privileged beings who begin to fathom their implications gradually lose all interest in the outside world, to such an extent that they eventually become content to nourish their brains and nervous systems with their own muscles, sinews, internal organs, and, finally, bones. The Holy Sacrament continues until such time as they lie completely helpless and emaciated, a mass of violently twitching, pulpy wet neurons upon which a pair of raw, pulsating stalks blossom into bloodshot, weary, hypertrophic eyes, beatifically sedate and heavy-lidded. It is said that in one of the lesser-known byways of the Inferno, Pete Seeger sings eternally indistinguishable chestnuts of American folk song as, all the while, rotting, cancerous nodes gradually encircle, inflame, and finally sever his vocal cords one from the other. This process repeats itself in perpetuity. Garrison Keillor is, needless to say, master of ceremonies. The applause is deafening. It is, after all, a human interest story. There was a train that used to pass by my house just before dawn. No matter where I was or what the position of my body, it would pass just behind me, a bit elevated, and to my left. No one else ever heard it, which, to me, proved its existence beyond any shadow of doubt. On any given night, it might be carrying Polish Jews on their way to Dachau, goats with red slits for eyes, piled high and suffocating atop one another, gouging each other's flesh, and praying goat prayers. For the sweetness of a swift oblivion, carloads of moronically babbling nouveau rich, swollen with food, liquor, and unearned wealth, returning to their multi-terraced underwater stucco dwellings, proudly exchanging photos and anecdotes of their gilled, pampered, and fish-tailed children, refugee Rwandan women, screaming in pain and clutching wildly at the doors and windows, in hopeless attempts to escape, pregnant to bursting with their famished, already toothed unborn, and my father reading with his legs up, happy deaf to my pleas and shrieks as I ran alongside, wildly panting, with my heart violently pounding. If you see him, do let him know how hard I tried to reach him, how very hard, only to find that his heart had burst into flames long ago, his ears and mind eaten away by worms. There were times when I would flinch wildly, causing the train to disengage from its tracks and sail through the endless vacuum of space. I would then become aware of a goat-hoofed stranger, well, at first a stranger now, perhaps a friend, sitting comfortably and patiently at the right foot of my bed as I lay there paralyzed in milky, monstrous sleep, waiting, dreading, who had been there since the very beginning, before I was even a twinkle in my wretched parents' gangrenous eyes, noting my progress from bud to bloom to bulbous concupiscence, taking careful note of the ever-growing stench of decay which surrounded me. Waking, sleeping, fleeing, it mattered not. A farmer, a fisher of men, the one for whom days and years, centuries and eons mean nothing. His shroud was draped long and low, comforting in the way only terror can be comforting. Terror I well knew was there all along, right behind that all too familiar fold, there in the fabric of space-time into which I would sometimes fall soundlessly, into that fiendish, crumb-filled pants pocket, in which long dormant, gaping maws shred the living, randomly and mindlessly, in their forever dreamless sleep. There was nothing grand or theatrical about it. No monolith slabs, no games of chess, tunnels of soothing white light, or honeyed affirmations of the dearly departed. Quite bureaucratic, really. Clinical, the same old tale Beelzebub has been telling his grandchildren since the Big Bang, endlessly regurgitated and recycled, calm, without affect, signifying nothing. He is stupendously bored. Truth to tell, the old fellow. But needs must engage in the telling once more. For, if he doesn't, he too would be liable to be shred to bits by older gods, and furies of whom even he is horror-struck. As a child, I used to leave the closet door, sometimes open, sometimes closed, to either be aware of his coming or in a feeble attempt to bar his entry. I suppose I was at least sometimes successful, for, at times, I slept soundly through his relentless and inevitable visits, soothed by sham defenses and the nearness of two who promised my eternal protection. That they did, during waking hours, come the gloom of midnight, and suddenly, there they were again, masks off, joined with him, in a witch's Sabbath of violence and gleeful sadism. One has joined hell's ranks. The other clings to a cliff by a bitten, broken-off fingernail. They were the white noise purporting to insulate my child's sleep against the jingle-jangle mourning of the devil's sanitation crew. And they were that crew, as well, proud to be in the very most front ranks of its demons, amongst its most fervently ambitious perpetrators. How I miss the old underground brothel. It's a shame the feds smoked the mob out of what was, for them, such an uncharacteristically creative business. I remember the cranky, painted crone who stood like a sentinel at the tunnel's entrance with an absurdly self-important seriousness, as if she were collecting tickets at some exquisitely renovated Baroque church for a performance by the Tallis scholars of Joshkan and Palestrina. An elementary school cafeteria lady, surely, who had been picked up, wriggling and screaming in the talons of a rapacious pterodactyl, dipped in a hot, bloody river of yellow piss venom and Salisbury steak gravy, and deposited, along with thousands of other indistinguishable, eviscerated elementary school cafeteria workers in this hellish Madame Tussauds Hall of Mirrors. Directly behind her, a large and overly lit room in which enormous silicon-enhanced breasts hung from hideous, ancient heads with red-rimmed, exhausted eyes and disfigured collagen lips, looking as if they had been stuck on by a blind, drunken potter, mouths which hawked caged sideshow hookers, large swaths of whose skin hung from garden stakes, women with bloody, lidless eyes where nipples ought to have been, the mouths on their violently stretched face masks, attempting to violently drown one another out with their snarled, grunted offers of vigorous fellatio, all the while navigating through a room strewn full of random sacks of ancient hag titties and severed limbs of long-gone great-aunts, pulsating, gesticulating in wild proto-flesh speak. A real man ought to have been able to enjoy himself there. Were I a real man, I could most certainly have enjoyed myself there, had I not been forced by something broken within me to slink off, craven, defeated, and having spent nothing of myself. A real man would not invariably begin to obsess how they and he were made mostly of empty space, and become suddenly, hopelessly paralyzed with the fear of falling into the infinite vacuum, which was rapidly opening up just beneath him. Can you see them in the hall there? The ghoulish vampires, with their razor-sharp nails, whispering, smirking, waiting for the carefree athletes and sailors? I remember, on each occasion, looking desperately for an exit. There was, invariably, only one. A whip-vicious, violently lurching log flume ride, in which one squirmed, desperately nauseated, like a boneless mouse, clutching one's torn, bloodied ears in an attempt to avoid their deadly, narcotic, repulsive, yet infinitely seductive siren song, wafting down like poisonous incense from above. At the library, there are drafty catacombs, lined with the dead and cast-off skins of still molting cultures. Long ago, I rubbed myself eagerly against those delicious, velvety casket linings, so full of solace, and the promise they would somehow protect me from the horrors and cataclysms which lurked outside. Oh! To experience again that first flush of my easy, effortless immortality, to be encased in the milky white bosom of my flawless infant skin, encased in the inexhaustible milky white bosom of sweet, Dream-filled nights spent removing from that still pristine skin the dried newsprint of presumed eternal profundities, before that skin turned leprous, before the once bejeweled stars of my youth grew faint, before my once lean, rapacious body came to feel so appallingly strange, before it came to eventually denounce me. When a man's brain has been stuffed, once too often, full of the petty ruminations of tyrannical ancestors, only then does one come to betray himself. And what he might have been, or might have kept on being, sufficiently to become a philosopher, to bid adieu to the land of the living, to choke to death, to drown, hopelessly affixed to the head of a pin, surrounded by incessantly garrulous blowhards screaming endless filth and nonsense from their abyss into what has now become one's own. Oh, you men who think or say that I am malevolent or misanthropic, how greatly do you wrong me? I am no easily dismissed. Black as pitch class clown, buried to the neck in a quicksand of self, burbling stale, exasperating witticisms. You would have me gentle, nourishing others, like fresh rain and Japanese gardens, full of grace and humility, fools and blind men all. I will feed and clothe you, only to stab your fat and stylishly bedecked guts to the quick, spilling what was left of and in you to the ground, as you watch helplessly and stupendously betrayed. I am that, but much else besides. I will spin your skin anew on a loom made of galaxies, into fingers which reach, tendril-like and delicate, into the endless abyss of everything and nothing, wildly flailing and thrashing about in the desperate hope of a familiar touch or sensation. I will wind your starry fingers through my own, until the powdered universe binds and fuses us into a single filament, and rains down a honeyed forgetting, which will course, delicious and sensuous, through our infinitely supple, once again infant veins. Look, listen, feel, we are, for this infinitely brief, ecstatically astonished moment, and hence, for all eternity, born again.